Hey folks, if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss anything. Means a lot. Alright, settle in. This one's real. My name is Michael. I grew up in the hills of eastern Kentucky, deep Appalachian country, the kind of place where the mountains press in close and the winters feel personal. Just me, my mom and dad, and my two younger sisters, Sarah, who was 9, and little Maya, who was 4. We raised livestock the way families out there had always done. This was about 25 years ago. I was 11. Our house sat on the side of a ridge, a few other homesteads visible through the tree line. Below the house, dug partway into the hillside, like something the land had swallowed, was our barn. The entrance was rounded, low, patched together over the years with scrap wood and old tin roofing, held up more by habit than by any real engineering. Dad kept a wood burning stove in there through the winters to keep the animals from freezing. The walls near the door were black with years of soot, stuffed with dead brush and whatever insulation my grandfather had crammed in there decades before. Winters in those hills were something else. Coyotes and worse would come down off the mountain looking for food. No matter how many times Dad reinforced the barn entrance, something always seemed to find a way through. And when they got in, they didn't take one animal and leave. They went through everything. One evening in the dead of winter, Dad found me in the kitchen and put a hand on my shoulder. Michael, I want you out in the barn with me tonight. School's out. Time you started learning how it's done. I was glad for it. Any chance to be around him? Yes, sir. After supper, we headed down together. We had cots already laid out on a rubber mat near the stove, same as Dad had done for years by himself. He got a fire going, feeding it from a burlap sack of kindling in the corner. When the flames caught, he closed the grate and we settled in. Say your prayers before you close your eyes, he said. The barn was warm. The animals were quiet. I was almost comfortable. Then the fire exploded. Not like a backdraft. Nothing you could explain that way. The stove just seemed to lurch, the metal popping, heat pushing out through the grate seams. And from somewhere inside it came a sound that I have spent 25 years trying to find the right word for. A scream, not a mouse, not an ember popping. Something that understood what it meant to suffer made that sound, and it lasted maybe 3 seconds before it cut off clean. Every animal in the barn went rigid. Then, when the sound died, they went still all at once, like something had pressed a hand down over the whole room. Dad stood up slowly from his cot. He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked around the barn away. He looked at fence lines after a storm, checking for damage, checking for what he'd missed. Probably a mouse got into the kindling, he finally said. But his voice was flat in a way that told me he was saying it for my benefit, not because he believed it. He closed the stove and told me to lay down. He rolled over on his cot back to the fire. Lord, grant us rest, he said quietly, and went still. I stared at the ceiling. I was shaking, not from cold. That sound had settled somewhere in my chest and wasn't moving. I don't know how long it took, but sleep eventually came for me, whether I wanted it or not. I woke up to scratching. My eyes opened fast, every nerve already pulled tight. My first thought was something got in. It happened. Dad had warned me. You hear something in the night, you don't ignore it. But as I lay there listening, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the barn, from inside the walls. It started low, a dry, rhythmic scraping, like something being dragged slowly across rough wood. Then it built, the way a storm builds, the way you feel it before you hear it, until it filled the whole space with a sound that had no business coming out of any living thing. I pressed my palms flat over my ears and couldn't move. The only light in the barn was the dull red glow bleeding through the stove grate. It threw long shadows across the floor and the far wall. As I stared at it, I watched one of those shadows bend, not with the flicker of the fire, but on its own, folding and stretching in directions that didn't match anything in the room. Then the scream again, louder this time. The boards shook, dust fell from the rafters. Dad came off his cot like a shot. In the name of God, he grabbed the stove grate with his bare hands, shoved back the coals that had jarred loose onto the floor, and slammed it shut. He stood there with his hands braced against the stove door, breathing hard. Then it was over. The sound, the shadow, gone like they'd never been. Dad stood in the quiet for a long moment. Then he walked back to his cot and lay down without a word. I was flat on my back, staring at him, every muscle in my body locked. What was that? I whispered. He looked at me across the dark. This place gets under your skin at night, he said. Drink some water. Go back to sleep. He poured me a cup from the thermos. I drank it. My hands were still shaking when I set it down. Sleep came again. I couldn't stop it. In the dream, I saw Helen. Helen lived next door with her mother, Aunt Sally, a small, sharp-boned woman who'd been blind since birth. Helen's brothers had left for the city after their father passed, leaving just the two of them. Helen was somewhere around 40, never married. Years back, she'd fallen hard for a boy from a neighboring town. He chose someone else. After that, something in Helen had come partly loose, not broken, not crazy, just tilted. She had good stretches and bad ones. On her bad days, she'd stand in the yard and stare at things that weren't there. In the dream, she was screaming, "You did this. You killed him." She was coming at me, tearing at her own face. Grief and fury twisted together into something I didn't have a name for. I tried to back away, and she kept appearing in front of me. Then something rose up at my back, shapeless, black, swirling like smoke that had learned how to think, and its voice came from everywhere at once. "You will pay for this." I couldn't move, couldn't make a sound. It rushed toward me and church bells. I snapped awake in the grey pre-dawn, gasping, drenched through with sweat. Dad was already up, sitting on the edge of his cot, reading his Bible in the thin light coming through the grate. He looked over at me for a long moment. "Same thing." I just nodded. Morning came slow. We did the feeding, the milking, the whole routine. Same as always, the kind of work that keeps your hands busy even when your mind won't settle. When we came up to the house for breakfast, Dad sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. "We're going to see Reverend James today." Reverend James lived in the next town over. He was old, had been old for as long as anyone could remember, and he dealt with things that other men of God tended to step around. People drove from 3 counties away to sit at his kitchen table. Dad had met him once before, years ago, and hadn't forgotten him. We walked the road out of the hollow together. Near the edge of the property stood the ruins of an old stone building, walls still standing, roof long gone, the interior black from a fire. that had happened before anyone alive could remember. Local kids said settlers had been burned out of it. Nobody went near it. As we passed it that morning, Dad slowed. Helen was standing in the gap where the door used to be, not moving, not blinking, far as I could tell, just watching us with her head tilted slightly to one side, the way you look at something you're trying to place. "Morning, Helen," Dad said carefully. "Everything all right?" "Nothing." She looked straight through us until we turned away and kept walking. My legs felt loose the rest of the way there. Reverend James listened to everything without a word. When Dad finished, the old man sat back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. A clock ticked on the wall. Then he said, "Anything else unusual outside of the dreams?" Dad told him about the sound from the stove, the scream, what he thought it was and what he knew it wasn't. The Reverend's expression didn't change exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. He looked at me and said, "Son, step out on the porch for a bit." I sat on the porch steps and watched them through the window. Reverend James talked fast and low, one hand pressed flat on the table. Dad sat without moving, listening the way he listened to hard news, jaw set, eyes steady. After a while the Reverend stood, disappeared into the back of the house, and came out with two small cloth bags, hex bags, tightly sewn, bulging with things I couldn't see. He handed one to Dad and one to me when I came back inside. "These go around your neck. You sleep in them, you bathe in them, you don't take them off for any reason." "Not any reason. You understand me?" "Yes, sir," I said. Dad looked at me hard. "Don't take it off." "Michael, I won't." We shook the Reverend's hand and headed home. The ruins were empty when we passed them this time. Small mercy. Aunt Sally was sitting on her porch when we came up the road. She was facing away from us, facing the wrong direction entirely. But the moment we stepped onto the gravel at the bottom of the hill, she turned her head straight toward us. Didn't hesitate, like she'd been waiting. "Is that you?" "Robert," she called out, using my father's name. "Did you see her? Did you see Helen out there?" Dad stopped walking. "Yes, ma'am. Down by the old ruins." Aunt Sally's face did something complicated. She turned and called sharply into the house. Helen appeared in the doorway a moment later. The old blind woman reached out, found Helen's wrist without looking, and guided her inside without a word. Dad and I stood on the road until the door closed. "How'd she know we were coming?" I asked. He was quiet for a moment. People who can't see tend to pick up on things the rest of us walk right past. He said finally, and we went home. Spring came in late that year, the way it does up in those hills. One Saturday in April, Dad and Mom took Sarah down to the lower pasture. The animals needed fresh grass, and the mud had finally firmed up enough to move them. They left me in charge of little Mia. Mom had made Mia a small cloth ball. We were in the yard, tossing it back and forth. Sun out, nothing wrong with the world. I don't know how long I was gone. I came back to myself standing at the barn door with Maya's hand in mine. No memory of walking there. No idea how long we'd been standing in that spot. Mia was looking up at me like she was waiting for me to do something. Then Aunt Sally's voice cut across the yard. Sharp, panicked, louder than I'd ever heard from her. I turned. She was collapsed against her fence post. No shoes, no coat. Hands stretched out toward us. Her blind eyes aimed directly at where we were standing. Neighbors came running from down the road. They got her inside. I grabbed Mia and ran back to the house, and we sat at the kitchen table and didn't move until our parents came home. When I told Dad, he went pale. "Where's your hex bag?" I reached for my collar. "Nothing there. I took it off in the shower this morning. I forgot to put it back." He held up a hand. "Find it. Put it on right now. And don't you take it off again." He wasn't angry. That almost made it worse. Reverend James came to the house a few days later. He walked every room, prayed over every door frame, opened every window for a few minutes, and then closed them again. He spent a long time in the barn. When he came back up to the house, he sat with my parents at the kitchen table and talked low for almost an hour. Before he left, he stopped in the doorway and looked back at my father. "Keep that Bible on the wall. Keep praying. What's attached to this place has limits, but it'll find every gap you leave it." He walked out into the dark, and we watched his headlights disappear down the road. Years later, when I was old enough to hear it straight, Dad sat me down and told me everything Reverend James had shared with him that first day. The part they hadn't let me hear. It started with the burlap sack, the one full of kindling we'd burned in the stove that first night. That sack had belonged to Helen. When Helen was young, desperate and half out of her mind over a boy who didn't want her, she sought out a woman who'd been passing through the area, a root worker. People called them in those hills, a conjure woman. Helen told her what she wanted, and the woman told her to meet her at the old ruins after dark, said she'd show her what needed doing. Whatever they started that night, it didn't finish the way either of them planned. The conjure woman died in that building, neck broken, no sign of a struggle, no explanation that satisfied anybody. From that night forward, something came home with Helen. She carried it for years without telling a soul. She was still carrying it when she got pregnant. Nobody knew, nobody except maybe Aunt Sally, who couldn't see but felt everything. Helen had been using our barn to hide what she couldn't explain. And when Dad and I burned her kindling in that stove, when we fed that fire with whatever had been wrapped up inside it, we destroyed something that had no name, but knew exactly who we were. The thing that had attached itself to Helen didn't distinguish much between us and her. We'd taken something from it, so it collected. If you hadn't been praying, Reverend James had told my father, if that Bible hadn't been in your house, a conjured thing like that, fed by fire, it doesn't let go of a family. It goes through them one by one until there's nothing left. Our Aunt Sally passed that summer quietly in her sleep. The whole community came out. Helen sat on the porch through the burial, dry-eyed, staring at the middle distance. When her brothers drove back to the city and the cars cleared out of the yard, she was alone for the first time in her life. That night, the stones hit our house. Windows gone, the porch rail splintered. We pressed under the heavy kitchen table while the sound of something tearing through the walls above us mixed with screaming from next door. A woman's voice, or something that had learned to use one. Dad grabbed the Bible off the wall and went out alone. We followed anyway. The night was cold and perfectly still. No wind, nobody on the road. Dad crossed the yard and pushed open Helen's front door. Inside, almost nothing left. A bare floor, an empty cradle sitting in the center of the room and spread around it in a rough circle. Tangled hair, scraps of material, what looked like old animal bones, broken glass, and dark stains across the lower half of the walls that hadn't been there before. Nobody spoke. Helen was on the floor near the far wall, breathing. Then the house groaned, deep and structural. The sound of something giving way from the foundation up. Get out. Everybody out. Now. Dad grabbed me. I grabbed Sarah's hand. We ran. The roof came down, maybe 10 seconds after the last person cleared the door. Dad had us loaded into the truck before sunrise. We drove to Nashville, stayed with relatives for a month, and never went back to that hollow. Dad found work in the city, got us into an apartment, built a life from scratch. He never talked about it much, not until I was grown and asked him directly. Some things, he said, you just carry forward and don't set down. I've heard things over the years from people who still live near that area. Nobody goes near where those two houses stood. They say on certain nights, you can hear something that sounds like a child's voice, singing or crying. It's hard to tell which. And sometimes, they say, you catch a glimpse of a woman walking the old fence line in the dark, looking for something she lost a long time ago. I don't go back there, but I still wear the hex bag. That's the story. Folks, thank you so much for listening. It really means a lot to me. I love you all. If you're not subscribed yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next video. Take care.